what controls what in the cluster from every role. So we go down through this. So for administration, essentially policies, who can do what, all controlling what will ultimately be the authorization schemes is all handled by Ranger. Ranger can do it for just about every component in the cluster now. And they're always improving that. So like in the last release, they now made it so that not only can you define policies just based on general permissions, like user group-based permission, but now you can have dynamic policies based on tags of data, based on Apache Atlas. I'll get into that a little bit later, but you have a pretty wide array of options now for how you can dynamically define policies within the cluster. What's not listed here is that the other integration that's required is Embari, which handles its own security. So the only distinction here is that Embari is basically its own project, and so it doesn't share the security with everything else like Ranger does. You basically have to set security twice, right? Once for Ranger whole cluster and once for Embari. Means when I say set security, that means integrating with AD and then integrating with Kerberos.
Embari is a pretty small set.
Typically, I mean, not always, because sometimes you'll have Embari views. You want those to be available to. You can even run Embari views as standalone applications. So, like if you want everyone to use the Hive UI in Embari, and you wanted 1,000 people to do that, you can do that. Another common use case is Zeppelin. Zeppelin just recently got its own authentication, but a lot of times it's easier to manage that as Zeppelin through an Embari view. So you may do that. I don't know that really applies to you guys. I don't know what you're planning.
Yeah, it depends on specifically the data science group and how they would interact.
Yeah, so a tool like Zeppelin really could be powerful for a guy that's on it. So, or people like him, the ability to log into that would be really helpful. So that requires basically the two components that I just talked about. So who here doesn't understand Kerberos or what it does when I say how it works?
I understand that at a high level. I mean,
Okay.
we're using Kerberos for moving UI for traveling.
Okay, all right. So in Hadoop, there really is no such thing as security in Hadoop without Kerberos, because there's actually really no way to truly prove your identity. So it's a mandatory step essentially to really actually be able to say that your cluster is secure. I don't know if you guys want me to dive into actually how Kerberos works. Okay.
Nothing's off the table as far as I'm concerned.
So it's going to sound a little too low level, but actually I think it's important to understand. Knowing the vernacular that Kerberos uses is pretty helpful. So there's essentially we have a key distribution center or KDC that in this case we're going to run within our cluster itself. And we'll actually also on this. This is essentially what I'm talking about. So when your client wants to connect to something like Apache Atlas or directly Hive Server 2, what will happen is you'll first need to get a ticket out of the KDC to authenticate and prove who you are. So what you do is your request is basically a comprised of your password encrypted to a key, so that you never actually send your actual password out. to the KBC. The KBC then is the only thing that knows what your password is. It's the only, you have to establish that trust essentially. Then if it's able to decrypt the request, it returns to you what's called a ticket granting ticket. Sounds terribly redundant, but with the ticket granting ticket, which typically lasts by default 8 hours, you now have the ability then to request tickets to connect to different components within the cluster. Or if you're, in this example, to Apache Knox. So then you'll request again saying, I want to connect to Knox, and then the KC will return and give you back a ticket that you can then connect to Knox with. Knox, the ticket has the key for Knox in it. Knox is able to decrypt it. It knows that you're authenticated within allow you to get. So for you two guys over there, it means that you're going to have to handle getting these tickets in all your applications. We'll obviously help you with that, but it's one change that you have to make. For all of these services running within the cluster, they will have what is essentially like a persistent ticket or a key tag that they will handle internally. But for anything else that's connecting externally, like DIH or anything coming out of the JVC connections, they'll also have to support Kerberos. So it's a change that you guys will have to be aware of as we're working on all these integrations. Any questions about? I kept it reasonably high level. Any questions about Kerberos, what's involved, and the impact it can have?
Do we need to add anything in our code? Do we need to modify or add anything in our code in order to run our code in the production server?
The way you're running your code right now, as your user, you will need to basically do a KNet to have your user session basically have the ticket, and then when you run a Spark job, you're doing Spark submit, it will know that and grab the ticket and then use it to submit. If you are running a service, you're building like a daemon or something like that, or something that's going to be persistent, then you're going to need to probably init with a key tab to support that. And in that case, you and I will work together. I will generate a key tab for your service. But you'll always have to do that step before the application runs. Yes, yes. So what I was doing with these slides is just kind of breaking down all the levels you go to, from basically no security, directly to high circuit 2, which is what we're doing right now. And then the step we're working on right now, which is integrating Active Directory to the KDC. And then you can connect high server 2 directly to the KDC so that it can handle its own authentication. The next step after that is you add Ranger to provide all the authorization policies that happen on Hive. So, Kalo can see table A, but not table B. Krishna can not see a certain column. I can access Hive only at 3 a.m., whatever you want to do.
And that's within Ranger?
That's all within Ranger, right? So that's kind of the difference. Remember, Kerberos, authentication, Ranger, authorization.
Okay.
And then typically your in-state walled off architecture, which is, you have a firewall that's around the cluster, and then you're using a gateway of Apache Knox to basically do all this for you. This actually makes it a lot easier for all the clients because Knox can shield you from having necessarily to support Kerberos. It can handle getting the ticket for you, so you just have to authenticate with something like a password, or you can choose any number of authentication methods. So Knox can be a way to, if you have clients that can't really support Kerberos, but they can support something like a RESTful API, then it can be a solution to help you maintain a secure cluster, but be able to get connectivity. But you can also, take it through Macs as well. So. All right, any questions about Knox and essentially?
Is this applying it to the way that you're installing it now? Are you showing it as options, or are you showing it as the way?
So it's going to look like this, except that certain services will obviously be able to penetrate through this firewall and access services like HiServer 2 directly, or HBase server.
Like as we are now, Tableau would go through Knox. It'll
Correct.
HiServer 2 directly.
Correct.
So not really.
That's correct. Yeah, and that's a good way to do it. It's nice to be able to have any service you can connect directly to HiServer 2. You want to do that, but down the line when someone over in another department's like, hey, is there a way I can get access to this? Well, without having to jump through a lot of hoops, it's just and adding them to an OU and AD, instantly give them the ability to Knox, and then you don't have to open any ports or anything like that, or figure out any kind of crazy routing. They can hit Knox, and they can do most everything on the cluster. And so it gets someone up and running. But for something you probably don't want to use Knox for is anything that involves a significant volume of data, because that's not really what it's built for. So if you're going to move large files through, while you can do it through Knox, if it's going to become a regular thing, then you should seek a more direct path.
So DIH won't work for that.
No.
Or like for SKU everything or something.
Right, exactly. So, one-time or frequent use of basically hitting HDFS through Knox, I think it's fine, but you can. Some environments that it's a requirement, you have to do it, but then you need to scale out Knox and actually have multiple instances of it, and then probably a load balancer in front of it. So it just complicates the environment a little bit. But this is basically what I was talking about. I forgot how to say. This is my answer. Yeah, we talked about Knox. Yeah, essentially the idea of eliminating an edge node doesn't really become real, I think, but that was the intention, the hope, and then its ability to basically reach out to any of the internal APIs in the cluster, to controlling the security from outside the cluster also. And this is essentially what I was just talking about, where you can do a load balancer. We had a lot of features on it. The downside is that a lot of clients don't natively support Knox because it's relatively new within the Hadoop ecosystem. Most JDBC clients do, but for the other APIs like the HBase API, UCs, and your own HDFS, you may have to either integrate or write an adapter to basically convert those APIs to work over the REST interface. So here's an example of the different APIs and what they look like within the cluster. Another notable or thing to call out that security teams like is that Knox will obscure the host names and IPs of where the actual services are running. So all you see from the outside is Knox, and when you call these internal APIs, you can't actually tell that, like, Hive runs on node 304 or whatever. So the key part on what's new for Knox here that applies to us is the support for single sign-on. And we met early in the project with Mark, talked about that, and we're ready to implement that. And that's what you guys will do here too. You'll support the new sensitive sign-on interface to basically do all your authentication. All right, Ranger. The way Ranger works is essentially it creates little plugins that go out and attach to all the different components within the cluster and adds its functionality to them. So, for example, say like for HDFS, there's essentially a Ranger plugin that attaches to that. It goes and talks to the Ranger admin server, gets the latest version of the policies, downloads them, keeps a copy of that, so that even if the Ranger admin UI or server goes down, it has whatever the latest copy of the policies were. And that's how it works for all the different services. So, Hive, HBase, Kafka, Solar Storm, Maps, and Map5, there's actually a couple more too. And then it has the ability to, so I don't think you guys have an interest in doing over-the-wire encryption and data at rest encryption. It hasn't been brought up as requirements. But managing the keys for that is handled within the Ranger KMS system. And then one of the most important parts is auditing. You can see within Ranger, every time a policy was challenged, you can see that log for every service. So if you want to know like who accessed this table at this time, you can look. And that's essentially for any component that
It's pretty much a security changes aspect to integrate with one of their tools.
So the ability to basically output, so we can send it to wherever they need to be. So this is basically what I was talking about just a moment ago with the plugins, how they connect to the policy server, report their access back to the audit server, the administration portal, and then two different backends for that audit data, be it like Solar or normal HDFS, or just Apple to fine. And then there's an integration API so that if you have authorization suites that can integrate with Ranger. I don't believe you guys have anything that qualifies to do that.
Hey, Ashby, what was the name of that tool that I think you had sent an email about it, and someone on the security team had asked us about it too, where they were wanting us to ship logs for authorization.
You're referring to ArcSight.
ArcSight? Yeah, that sounds right. So that's the tool. I think it's been a while ago.
Kind of hard to see this. But in Ranger, essentially this is what the UI looks like. Actually, why don't we have a look at the Ranger UI. So in Ranger, here's what the UI looks like. So say like for Hive, I can go in, here's all my list of policies, and they apply in this order. So for example, I have this policy here. That basically says on the database of Food Mart, on all tables, I allow Rajdocs to basically do everything. Holder be able to do a select, create, and drop, and then Maria and Amy to be able to do a select. Right? And so for us, basically we would be using groups that we've gotten out of AD. And we probably want to do this for individual users, but we have the ability to. So, if Taylor's like, hey, can you give me temporary access to this table? I'm like, well, you're having lunch, talk about it. Then I can throw them in here and I'll be good.
So through AD user groups, not through something like a grant to individual.
That's correct. So normally when we're used to thinking about databases, we're used to databases having the grant system, right? So I have to go in and write those for every different user or something like that. And Hive actually does have that, but we are overriding it with Ranger in this case. And so we are actually applying it here. If you're reading the documentation on Hive, you might get confused because it's going to have all this stuff about like how to do grants, and you should just ignore it because that's what you would do if you're not using it.
So we are not going to use security permissions through Hive. We'll do it through here.
And you'll that email level or
Looks like we can go database
Yeah,
table,
column level
also.
down to the column level.
Column level.
Yeah.
you go all the way to column level. You can even do column massing. I don't have it enabled on this particular version, but you can say at the column level, like I want to not show that to them. I want to show them a modified version of the data. You can even write your own custom method if you want that applies.
I think we can
Do all
also
the data massing.
we can also do specific time also, right? Like only for 30 days, this user can access this table.
Yes.
We can also do that.
Hmm.
So you can
Interesting.
do.
But who manages this?
Hadoop
I mean,
admin.
translate it from,
This
okay. How long you say?
is already.
I don't want any part of that.
We're gonna have a meeting tomorrow about organization, and one of those struggles includes this.
Yeah, because, I mean, this is a whole different world. Right now, obviously what we do is DBA group manages permissions based on what myself or a data architect will tell them. And we do have role-based security set up like in DIDW, so I don't have to have every little individual. I can just say, this individual needs to be added to this role.
And that's what we want
This
to.
is similar, except for, I have to create different AD groups, right, for each.
Well, yeah, if you wanted more granularity, you would create an AD group, and then we would specify that group here. So let's say I had the IT group. That would correspond to an OU in Active Directory. And so hopefully then if we've done our jobs correctly, it's easier than getting added to that.
Yeah.
And then the policy will automatically apply, they'll have access. And then occasionally we'll come in here and we'll modify what group can do it, or, again, Caleb doesn't know.
What concerns me is that getting them added to an AD group is actually a longer route, as I'm sure you guys have experienced. Right? When I'm entering your snow request, it's not like there's an immediate turnaround.
So yeah, we can
Whereas
do the opposite.
today, I can, I can reach out to a DBA and say, I want you to run this permission right now.
So basically, yeah, we can say we can override that, or just pick a specific user within a group, or we can create our own group.
So for a period of time, we could do maybe 2 weeks, add Smith K17,
Yeah.
but in the meantime, I'm having that ID added to the AD user group.
Yeah.
Okay.
There you go.
All right.
So that would work perfectly.
But you could also have the generic, you have the new access the user group, and you create your own groups within
Right.
your policy, which may be closer to what you would do with the FW.
So on the screen, this is where we would see, not see every user, but I would see any users that I've specifically called out. So all the service accounts, in our environment, they're all going to be created.
Yes,
Make my life miserable.
yes.
Um,
We tried.
I know. You guys did. Um,
What program, you know, that's part of what's in AD right now.
No. We've got a display name, and I don't know if we can expose that here at all.
right.
Right, because the display name we made intelligent, right? It's
Yeah.
cookies, but I don't know if we can.
Yeah. That might be worth me making a pass to range.
I think maybe it would be because, yeah,
Because of the fight.
87X and a bunch of numbers is not going to be, we're constantly going to be opening the spreadsheet. Which one is this?
Yeah, right. But basically we would see all of those or the groups that we've imported essentially from AD would all that show up. Let's see. Unfortunately, I don't have my audit store turned on, but if I did, I would actually be able to see all the different accesses from, like, hitting a high table, touching a file in your CFS. So, I know what you guys are doing.
Yeah.
Same with like login sessions, status of plugins. This will be more useful to me for debugging, but login sessions would be. Tag-based policies is a new thing. So in Atlas, I don't have one, unfortunately. I should have built one. Have the ability to add tags to the data. Anywhere in the cluster, you can basically create a little extra metadata about any set of data. So you can say, like, it's PII or something like that, or has a classification level. And then now we can change the security dynamically based on those tags. So if we have a policy of, like, well, only Krishna can see PII data, the rest of us, just have luck. And then Kelly identifies, like, oh, there's a PI data here, applies a tag, that policy is instantly enforced.
Okay.
So, and of course, reports, because everyone likes their fancy graphs.
Back on your initial screen when you said the policies will be applied in this order,
Sure.
how do you designate that? Because I was looking quickly before you made, I mean, is it based on policy ID or do you set a particular apply?
You set the order.
Okay. So there's nothing here that tells you this is the order that they're applying. You just know.
No, it's in this order here.
Okay. Oh, okay.
So what if you want to move 25 to up?
Change the policy ID.
So it is based on policy ID number, right? Okay, gotcha.
Let's see, how about audits? Yes, that's what the audit screen looks like, and you can see that clearly. We filter by, either what service or what kind of access or which user or which group. If we can actually delete something and blank it for it, I can go back and say no. Yeah.
You're right. Shoot.
One of us probably needs to go this. SXM, you want me to do that?
We are meeting that.
Okay.
I didn't get any.
And yeah, it's basically so it's a breakdown of the policy. I think it is a lot worse.
Yeah, he said that,
Pretty much all you do. There's like one.
Okay.
What we talked about with tab-based policies. So yeah, that's really helpful, especially for streaming sources of data, because then you can, if the streaming input source is able to identify a type of data and apply a tag to it, then the security policies immediately added.
Okay.
So if something like Kafka, that can be really powerful.
So can we use this tag-based policy in NiFi?
Yes, you can. Yeah, you can assign a tag in NiFi to the stream data.
Okay. I mean, can you give me some more like how to add the tag to NiFi processor?
It's in the API. I can present to you.
Okay, so we need to write API for that one.
No, there's an option within a processor to after you add the integrate the ability for Alice to do it, shows up then as the ability to define a tag.
Okay.
But most of the time you want to do it when you're writing your own processor because typically you can add a blanket tag for all this data and that's fine, but it's more powerful when you have the ability to assign tags dynamically based on the content of the data or something about some property of the data. And there you have your own processor and you assign it dynamically.
Sure.
Let's see, anything else? I'm going to go to yeah, row filtering as well as column filtering. I don't know if you guys have used this for that. This will be highly relevant to us.
We don't have anything like that today, but I could see where potentially, right? I mean, if you had differing external suppliers, you only want them to see their data. You're exposing dealer data, you only want a dealer to be able to see his data, not every other dealer's data. So, I mean, but we don't have anything like that today, but there's definitely a way to go with that route.
All right, so this is more about our encryption options, which again, I have heard a requirement for, and I don't recommend doing it unless you have a requirement to do it. You can choose data to be encrypted within Hadoop and other data sources that are not, and so I recommend doing that. But basically, the rule of thumb is you're going to take about 30% hit performance. Of course, but we can support it at rest, in transmission, so yeah, you don't have to go down all that path. This is just adds complexity, but it's all supported. So I'll spare you guys all the encryption and rest stuff.
You're working with, that's like you're working with other technologies.
Yes.
You're not, it's not built in.
Well, so yeah, so what I'm saying here is you have different ways you can do encryption and rest. You can do OS level. Okay, Red Hat, OS encryption. Or yeah, you could use something like it's about what the enterprise dictates is this is the acceptable level of encryption. Where the actual data itself is encrypted. The problem with OS level encryption is, okay, sure, if someone drives a car to the wall data center and steals a server, and then accesses the OS, yeah, they'll be able to see the data in blocks, but it's not going to be very meaningful without the main node to tie it all together and understand it and bring all the different blocks together across the file system. Whereas TDE is the actual block itself is encrypted. So there's really no way to get the content of the data with. I found myself the answer. So Spark SQL integrates with the Ranger. So are you guys using Spark SQL?
Not at this moment.
No, Spark SQL is cool, and there's lots of great development on it, but the truth is, it's just like Hive just outperforms it. It does. It's just all the effort that's gone into the optimizations for Hive, particularly based on ORC, makes it pretty compelling. So I use Spark SQL when I got a set of data that I'm looking at dynamically, and I throw it to a data frame. I just want to quickly answer some questions about it. Sometimes that's easy for me to do through a Spark SQL context, but through data that is more persistent and that I want to make available to either users or BI tools like that, Hive is the right tool. So I'm not trying to take anything away from the Spark SQL, but it's just Hive's pretty quick at the end of the day.
So I've heard, I think Hadoop needed to load a driver, right, for Spark SQL for Tableau.
Mm-hmm.
HPE, why would you need that versus if he's connected to the Hive tables?
Because if there's a set of data and it hasn't been put into Hive, or there's some kind of limitation where it's available through Spark but not through Hive, then the ability to connect to Spark SQL is useful, but should be discouraged for any data that we intend to process.
Basically, if they want to create some ad hoc report from Tableau using Spark SQL, they can do that.
They can do that.
Yeah.
I mean, a tool like Tableau should just probably still just use Hive. But if like one of us is creating a quick temporary data set and we want to quickly throw that up in a report and want to convert it to a Hive table, then this would be enough.
They recently got that connected into Tableau. Spark SQL to connect.
Okay.
Yeah.
But that is for data that's not in Hive.
Yes.
Okay.
Basically, if the user wants to see some report, ad hoc report on some good amount of data, they can probably run this Spark SQL code on top of the BDE using Spark.
Here can be applied to Spark SQL, or starting to be applied to Spark SQL.
Within Spark SQL, outside of them.
Well, the Ranger, you can assign policies and then you can apply them in Spark SQL.
Okay.
Send it to me.
Sorry.
Yeah, no, I've tried 4 times. I covered us for the stand-up, so I went down there.
And so this is really a slide more for you guys, but I'm sure you'll understand this and go through this, but basically how you'll integrate security with Spark, how it works. But we'll get you key tabs for your long applications and make your life easier. And generally, your HDFS policies are what's going to apply to Spark users as they work with data off the actual file system. So we're going to make a little find box for Christian so he doesn't use up all the space.
Yeah.
And you see it fast, go crazy. But that's it, essentially at a high level in a nutshell. It's simple, but there's a lot of details, there's a lot of small parts.
You say it's simple. Sure, it's simple.
I mean, look at this. You got like on and off switches. It doesn't,
Yeah.
come on, it doesn't get better than this. All right. Yes. So that's not necessarily a security thing, but it is a very important thing. So we do need to talk about that.
And if you can enable the Spark UI also, that would be great help for us.
The firewall request is out there. ASPI is on it.
Okay.
The other thing, Kelly, before you get too far down the path, is thinking about disaster recovery, especially as this stuff moves into production. So we've got several presentations we can walk you through on DR, and how to set that up. Again, like Todd said, it's really straightforward, unless you are using data encryption. There's some additional things that you need to know. Most customers set up at a different location, DR cluster, and they replicate periodically based on the usage of the data, so that they can, most of them are working with RPO or RTO numbers that are given by the organization. You know, we have to be back up within 4 hours or 8 hours.
Right.
And so the investment in the DR site and the environment is all part of designing that as a solution.
ASPI was disaster recovery in any of the conversations that you all had on the initial setup in Denver? ASPI, are you still on? Okay.
So, I'll be here too.
Let's hear it. Do we have time, or are we still on the yourself?
I think we're at the end of the security thing. We were going to talk about queues. I'll talk about queues real quick. So, an important part of our planning is how the resources of the cluster get allocated at any particular time. And so, this is very similar. I like the analogy of what's Hadoop today. I like the data operating system analogy. I feel like that's actually really applicable because it has the same responsibility of an operating system, which is I have a finite amount of resources, CPU and memory and disk. How do I allocate those dynamically for users and processes to be used in a way that's most effective or complies to a priority that I deem necessary? And Hadoop, the way we control that is with Yarn. So Yarn essentially is the soup Nazi of who gets this much memory, who gets this much CPU. And this is a UI where we can define policies for how that works. So a lot of times you'll have a policy where you'll have like a batch process queue. At any time, I want 20% cluster to always be available to these long-running batch processes that are handling data that it needs to be converted. And then I want to take 60% of the cluster resources and make that available to people doing stuff like dynamic Hive queries, to when no one's using the batch queue, the ability for the Hive queue to dynamically take that 20%, process starts up again, return that 20% back to that process. Makes sense, or was that just really confusing?
That makes sense.
Okay. It's really important because otherwise,
Sounds like a lot of management, and that it makes sense.
That's right. It is a lot of management.
Like, oh my God.
That's funny.
Yeah.
And someone else is hopping up all the resources.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. So I've done this with thousands of users and at a certain major bank. And yeah, it's everyone wants their
Everyone
process
thinks they're the most important, right? So,
you know, we a cost center based model. So my answer is it's like, oh, you want more.
yeah.
Was it take your lunch again?
Yeah, well, this is real money. These are big numbers. But I'll show you the compute power. And you know, you get really simple or you can make it really complicated, but essentially left in its default state, it's basically a big fight code.
Okay.
And that's not good because, you know, I'm going to kick off a job that consumes the entire cluster, and these guys are going to sit there and wait for me.
Right. Right. We can have Jonathan out there running the process as well and everything, right?
Yeah, right? Yeah. What I typically do in development environments is I set them to a fair policy. Basically, every time anyone does anything, it has the cluster. But in production environments, I never do that. At least not across the whole cluster. I may set certain queues within a data scientist team. Right? I'm not going to try to get in there and control each individual user. I'm just going to say, like, all right, you guys have a data scientist queue, and I'm going to 20%, and then I'll let you burst up to 60% or whatever the number is. And within that queue itself, it's fair policy. So I say, all of you in my eyes are fair. You guys work it out. And that works pretty well. And again, you know, they want more, you know, show them the money. But for stuff like batch, yeah, it's different. That's, you know, I typically have SLAs on certain processes, and this is basically where I can guarantee they'll be good. That would apply to stuff, so I will.
So is it within Yarn or somewhere else that we will set up specific job schedules, right?
So job schedules is a little bit different. That is typically handled by Uzi or by your scheduler of choice.
I mean, we use Tivoli, but is that what we should be using in this world? Or should we be using Uzi?
That's a good question. I'm looking to see what it supports for ratio class, but generally anything that can kick off a process will work. What's nice about Uzi is that it's very well integrated with the environment.
Okay.
What kind of stinks about Uzi is that you're basically writing these very verbose XML documents, and there's a little bit of a learning curve to do it.
Yeah, you can create some forks after one process.
Sure.
So after this process, you can kick off two processes parallelly.
Right.
After these two processes success,
And I can see that we want to do that. That's what we do on the power center side of the house, right? We have all these workflows and there's certain cadence and order that they must run in.
But yeah, unless you have a requirement, I would say just using Uzi is probably the way to go.
Because I'm going to be working on that. You know, not that lack of standards. I think this is another crossover task that with immediate need, but
right. What's the long-term direction for it? Yeah.
Yes, Automax has any plan to create the Uzi UI just like a hue?
Yes, there is. I can't give you date.
Okay.
There's also rumbling about replacing Uzi.
Okay.
And I also can't tell you anything for that. But for now,
We actually need for Uzi.
Can we do it for lunch?
we like to keep our product strategies a secret. It drives everyone insane.
Right.
They're getting better about it.
It's not a very good
Usually
thing
we
because
need
it's
to
open
write
source
XML
world, so
code.
you kind of see.
There is a tool called Hue where you can drag XML for you.
Oh, okay.
We would actually,
All right.
what we're building is a yarn or an Embark view that's going to manage Hue is deprecated. It's sunset.
Mhm.
So there's going to be a music view where you can do that. But I've used it, and there's a nice it's like an Eclipse-based tool for Uzi and all that. There's all these nice little GUIs, and I find that in the long run, I've never ended up using it. You always have to do that one thing that's not supported, right? And, okay, at the end of the day, it's an XML document. Yeah, it's a little bit of a pain in the butt, but you get good at everything. Once you wrap your head around it, it all makes sense.
If we did go down this path, it seems like a different class of administrative. All the things that we do, super administrative security, job, like day-to-day operations.
Right.
Unidentified at this time, we go in, and contextually it makes sense, right? You can see, oh, the security, you didn't want to do security, or there's too much processing going on here. But the informatica equivalent workflow person to go in and wash those down.
Okay.
And we can give one service account for Uzi, which can run all the jobs.
So in Uzi, there's basically two major components. There's the workflows, which describes how any one task executes, and then there's a scheduler that determines the frequency of which that workflow runs. As the admin, like I want to see my developers write the workflows and then hand off to me for scheduling. Because someone's got to have the grand oversight of knowing,
Right.
like, if everything runs at 7 a.m. or something.
Right.
But everyone can basically see the schedule, so it's pretty transparent. If you have the ability to run anything on the cluster, then essentially, just from an organizational point of view, it's good to have someone have the responsibility of the oversight of that.
It's not necessarily security, but more of the role. Like, are you serving as both an operational capacity and as a security? Not can you see it or not, but are you also watching those jobs?
Yeah, and of course, the monitoring of the performance, when errors happen and all that, kind of fits into that type of role. So I was setting up a Hadoop cluster, and I'm sitting in the data center. I just got there, and it's like really early in the morning. And so they're asking me about, well, what can Hadoop do for handling, like loss of machines or loss of resources, and I'm starting talking about like HFS and replication and all that stuff, and it's all great, and all this, redundancy. There's this old app one that's like, no. What can you do in the event that you lose everything? That's kind of rare. It doesn't really happen. What do you mean? And right then, like the whole building just starts shaking. Hear that? I'm like, yeah. It's like one day, an FA team's going to crash into this data center because we're at the end of the runway. When that happens, what's going to happen to my data? And I was like, oh, that's different. Yeah, we haven't built a solution other than disaster recovery. So that's what we got to, was basically creating an offsite Hadoop cluster.
And the product strategy, formerly we're using Falcon to do it. But they're basically decommissioning Falcon.
We actually didn't use Falcon before. We just used the CD.
We used Falcon, and there were like 4 different exceptions, so we ended up with replicating data using 4 different methods, depending on if it was high, H-based, if it was encrypted. We had to replicate the encryption keys, which wasn't supported by Falcon.
Oh, yeah, H-base is the best.
Did you want to, Danielle, that's us down again.
And at a telecom company, uh, H-based replication across basic continents. Yeah, right. And it worked great. It's amazing.
As long as you've got the network.
Well, they're the tier 1 providers, so they have it.
Yeah,
They
own the network.
All right, guys. I know that was kind of like a really wide range of subjects, but any questions?
Not yet.
You want to keep doing these?
Yes.
Okay.
I think so. I think for me it's helpful.
So maybe now we can dive into any of these topics a little bit lower level.